Republican and Democratic ballot. They got to choose which one to use. Most of that's pretty new for our state, and especially under the guise of a presidential primary. So it was a big deal for us, and it went very well. Like you, we had great turnout. Of course, we are always nipping at the heels of Minnesota for turnout. You guys are the champions on the turnout front, but we think we did pretty well this year. Our current projections have us around 43% of eligible population, which would be even better than New Hampshire. So pretty excited about that. Had a good turnout and a lot of people very interested. All right, so obviously we're both preparing for election security items, but we also have this big cloud over us, especially as elections officials, worrying about the coronavirus. Now, that's not specifically elections related or security related, but a lot of the same principles are at play when you're talking about that kind of event or incident. Are you, as an office, working with your county and local officials to try to figure out ways to address that and make it so that you can still run an election but simultaneously protect your population?
Yes. First, one quick housekeeping note. I noticed that the camera shot here includes the person who's sitting here with me, Bill Ekblad, our cyber navigator. I think he'll have some interesting things to add later as we get into election security, but just if you're wondering who that person is. So to your point about coronavirus, yeah, it's serious. We just this morning met with the Minnesota Department of Health to start the process that you're talking about. We've had communications, obviously, with our partners in the counties and cities. You know, we only half jokingly said around here that if our election here had been held just 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, I think it would be a far, far greater public concern. I hope that's not the case. I hope that prediction is a wrong prediction. But yeah, it's something we think about. And in Minnesota, like many of the states from which people watching right now come from, I hope we have the option of remote voting, of voting from home, of voting by mail. We're not a vote by mail state in the same way that Colorado is, or Washington or Oregon, but it's an option to vote without excuse, absentee, by mail, having the ballot come to you. That is something, frankly, that if on our way to our August primary and the November general election, if the coronavirus or any other issue becomes something that prevents people from wanting to congregate in public places, we will make a hard, hard push to steer people in the direction of that option for voting. So we're thinking ahead to August and November for sure on coronavirus. Yeah,
and we're in the same boat. Obviously, we're pretty fortunate that we had our primary so early, and it sort of looks like April and May is when this may hit more substantially nationwide. So I feel quite bad for our election colleagues around the country, because this is obviously a serious issue. We congregate people on election day and throughout an election period, both our population that's coming to a place to vote, but also all the people that are doing the work for you, all of your election judges and county and local elections administrators. And they're all in small spaces operating for 12 and 16-hour days over the course of an election. So that's a big concern, and we've been working closely with our local elections and Homeland Security folks that have been kind of aiding us in developing and rolling out our continuity of operations plan, which includes those kinds of issues related to viruses and other outages and sort of broader concerns that could affect an election. And then obviously we as an office have been developing those as well. I would advise those that are on this webinar that are thinking along those lines, you really should look back at your COOP now. Look at your continuity of operations plan. If you find that when you get to the point in which your election is about to go live, or you've got election day and you've got a pretty major outbreak in your part of the nation, you need to be thinking about how can I shift my required duties for that day and the people that need to be working in that space to a safe environment so that they can do their work. Is there a way that you can take your election system and employ these kind of safety measures? So those are big things that you should all be thinking about now. unless, of course, you're New Hampshire and Iowa and Minnesota and Colorado have kind of gotten this out of the way. We also have a state primary in June that obviously we're going to be looking at this very closely as we lead up to that. So it's a big deal that all of us should be paying very close attention to. On the election security front, so again, just had a primary. Did you guys have any election security incidents or issues that occurred on election day or as we approached election day that you can tell us about?
Well, so let me start broadly from the standpoint of security. I think it's safe to say we have no evidence as of now, I'm wording this very carefully, we have no evidence as of now that there was any intrusion or attempted intrusion from some outside source. As many who are watching now know, sometimes it takes time to determine these things. Famously or infamously in 2016, even the federal government didn't know and wasn't in a position to notify states like ours that we had been a target until some months after. I don't think that will be the case now. I think the federal government has learned its lesson. So I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying it's not readily evident all the time right afterwards. But right now we can say there is no evidence that that occurred. We did have some glitchy things. We had a poll finder go down for a period of time, and then an erroneous link was substituted in its place. That was an unfortunate incident that lasted for 17 minutes. Other than that, though, I called around to counties around the state to see if they were doing okay from a security standpoint and from other standpoints. And they at least reported to me on the phone, I did a fair sampling of our 87 counties in Minnesota, that things seem to be going very well. So the short answer is no, we don't believe so, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. And that's what I've largely heard from my colleagues around other states in these early primaries and caucus states. So obviously, that's kind of the way we want that to roll. We did have one small misinformation incident in our state, which there was a Twitter posting by a person who showed a picture of a precinct scanner and said that he was hanging out at the scanners, taking people's ballots and changing their entries as they slid them in. And it was pretty obvious from the get-go that there was no validity to that because we don't have precinct scanners. We're a central count state. So, and we looked at the equipment wasn't our equipment. And so we very quickly, Trevor Timmons on our IT staff, very quickly contacted Department of Homeland Security and Matt Masterson, who got us in touch with the right person at Twitter. And within an hour or so, the report was logged. They identified where the picture had come from. It actually came from a Virginia polling place 5 days earlier. And somebody had picked it, so they had taken it from a different tweet and put it onto their tweet. And they were able, Twitter was able to take down that posting in about an hour. The point of comparison is a couple of years ago when we had a Facebook posting that we asked to take down, that took us around 48 hours to get that down. So if those two things are comparable, and perhaps they're not, but they're close, that really speaks well of the relationship we now have with DHS and with all of the people at the federal level that were able to jump on that and get us some very quick resolution to that problem. I know that that's sort of an example of the kinds of things that a lot of local jurisdictions and state jurisdictions are facing nowadays. Have you guys had anything like that, or do you know of any other county issues related to misinformation or disinformation in this last election?
You know, thankfully, no, which is good, but we're always on the lookout for that. And just for those who are tuning in my judgment, Secretary of State offices or the like in states are in a tough spot. Obviously, it is our domain to talk about misinformation and disinformation with respect to matters that directly pertain to elections, time, place, and manner of voting, that sort of thing, technology, dates, etc. But I think, as we all know, having lived through the last couple elections, misinformation and disinformation is beyond that. And at least our position is that when it comes to things that could indirectly affect the elections that we administer or oversee, That's a tougher call for offices like ours. We are not the campaign cops. And so it's really not our place to police what candidate A says about candidate B, or what charges or countercharges we might see in an election campaign. I know that wasn't precisely your question, but those things can bear on an election. And they can cause, at least in our experience, I don't know about your state in Colorado, but they can cause calls or communications to our office because they do think that maybe we get in the middle of those things. So I predict that that might be a challenge over the next several months, that people might look to us to play a role that we're not particularly comfortable playing in terms of disinformation and misinformation that resides outside of the direct scope of elections. We'll see. I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why the federal government has been reticent to get in deeply into the misinformation, disinformation area, just because it really does sort of step on that First Amendment concern. I personally think that we sort of have pretty broad latitude there, because when somebody's lying about a campaign or lying about an election, they really sort of abandon their First Amendment protections. But you know, it is the case that the federal government's really wary about stepping into that. So it sort of behooves state offices and local offices to be to find some latitude in there to develop their own program, be the trusted voice, which is the NAS program that you've recently rolled out, which I think has been a very successful rollout, and you know, try to take some leadership in that area. And it's a tough line to walk, but it's, I think, pretty important, considering that we are the folks that really know what's going on in elections, and a lot of people out in the public don't, and they take the word of those that they read on social media. So let's dive into the deep end of the pool on elections. Can you talk to us? Obviously, Minnesota's got a great reputation on election security. You've had some real rock stars as your elections folks. Gary Poser was there for a long time. You got Dave Mieda, who's got a fantastic reputation in this area. What have you been doing since 2016 with your counties and as a state office to increase security for your elections technology?
Oh, a lot to say there. So I'll try to show some restraint. Part of it is just recognize it for what it is, which is a real and sustained and ongoing problem. I think that mindset just at the beginning really helps a lot. This is, as has been said many times before, a race without a finish line. And we have to treat it that way. There is no time to stop and congratulate ourselves and spike the football and do an end zone dance. That just is never going to happen. And so with that in mind, we've done a number of things. Obviously, we've gotten some help, some financial help from the federal government through the Help America Vote Act disbursements. Although I will say, Minnesota was the last state in the country to get that money. We have a statute in Minnesota, unfortunately, that calls for the state legislature to approve that money, even though it's federal money, before we can get it. And it was held up for a number of sort of political reasons for over a year. So we didn't get it until late. We just got it last July. Most everyone else got it in March of the previous year. But we put that money to work. One of the things that we have done is we really felt the need to redo, as in recode, our statewide voter registration system, the big database, the spine of the system in Minnesota, and I assume in other states as well. And despite the name, statewide voter registration system, it's sort of a misnomer because it does a lot more than just voter registration. And since its inception in 2004, it's been asked to do a lot more, both in statute and as a practical matter every day. And so though it was built very well in 2004, like a lot of things that were built well in 2004, like that flip phone that you loved back then, it really needs modernization, and that really at the code level. And so redoing that, recoding that is a 4-year project. That's it. Can't really be sped up. It's a 4-year project. So that's very expensive and time consuming, and we're doing that. We've staffed up and done that work. So we're into it now about 8 months. We wish we would have been further. We would have been about 2 years into it had we gotten the money on time. But I won't relitigate all of that. The other thing we've done is, well, sitting right next to me, We have followed the lead of other states, and I will say, the only advantage I can think of to being 50th in the country to actually receive this money is we have the benefit of other states' experience, including yours in Colorado, where we can ask our colleagues what worked, what didn't work so well. And one thing that we've heard from our colleagues around the country that has really worked is bringing in someone like Bill Ekblad here as a cyber navigator. For those who are tuning in and who aren't familiar, it's a person who is housed in our office, based in our office, whose mission it is explicitly to work with our partners in counties and cities and local units of government to make sure that they are every bit as secure as we are. I know it's a cliche, but sometimes cliches are worth repeating. We're only as strong as our weakest link. And in Minnesota, we have 87 counties. And only 9 out of those 87 counties, some in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, a couple elsewhere, only 9 have full-time, year-round, elections-only departments or personnel. In most of the rest of the state, in 78 other counties, the person or the group that does elections also does property taxes, ditch and drainage work, inspections, on occasion running public housing units. You get the idea. And that's probably the case in many of the states from which people come from who are tuning in today. So Bill's job is critically important. He's one person. He's being stretched very, very thin. And in this latest round of AVA money that came in December, we are hoping, when we get approval for that, that to give him some company and to make sure he has a deputy or perhaps more folks who can go around the state and help our counties. I think those relationships are very, very important. Bill, do you just want to say a quick word about that? Because he just started in December, and I think it might be useful to those tuning in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as the Secretary said, we're new to this function, but I think one of the things that jumped out right away was that there was, in fact, a gap in how we looked at election architecture, infrastructure. Mentally, I think of it in 3 large bins. There's the central core that the Secretary's office maintains, the database and the systems that are associated directly with it. That's sort of the guts of the whole system. And we've got a good handle on what it takes to secure that. Now, we're never going to guarantee that we got everything perfect. The nature of this line of work is that you don't know what you don't know. But that is, it's understandable and defendable architecture, if you think of it that way. And then you have the voting equipment that everyone uses in some form or fashion. A number of national vendors make that available to county and local governments. It goes through extensive federal testing by federally certified labs. It's recertified at the state level. There's a fairly significant body of security that envelops that voting equipment. But in the middle, you have this kind of gray space of the technology that sort of ties it all together. And that is what we're talking about in terms of the systems that the counties and locals depend upon to be able to conduct elections. So it's, in a lot of cases, off-the-shelf software, Windows operating systems, for example, that are used to tie into our central database, that are used to interface with the voting equipment. What are those counties doing to make sure they're defending that equipment? How sharp are they on awareness of best practices and latest versions and all the things that are required to guarantee that middle gray space is as tight as it can be? And so my job, again, as the Secretary said, is to work with those counties and locals, kind of level set their understanding of their critical role in defending the entirety of that structure, specifically with regards to the hardware that they own and operate to do their election operations jobs every day. That's how I would sum up the overview.
And as you can tell, it's a lot of work over 87 counties. And so it really is important to think, as I've said already in this presentation, them as our teammates, because at least in Minnesota, it really does take a team to put on an election. You know, just to give some perspective to those tuning in, I mean, it requires for us over 30,000 election judges or poll workers to put on an election. And that's not even counting the administrators in cities and counties and in our office as well. So it's a team effort. We got to make sure everyone on the team is secure.
Yeah, it's the change since 2016 has been pretty pronounced. And I know it's a big deal across the country, and based on the system in which you operate, obviously the changes are different. In Colorado, we had a lot of things already in place, like 2-factor authentication. We were already doing pretty elaborate training, so we have a certification program for our local elections officials. But where we were behind was we had an older voter registration system, just like you described, and it really needed quite a bit of work. And so one of the things we've done is we brought on a number of staff members on the IT side to develop that, .NET coders and security folks that can really improve your overall security related to your voter reg system, which seems to be the point of greatest vulnerability from the outside, from anybody around the country and around the world can attempt to access that system. So you need to really put up a lot of barriers to prevent that kind of access. That's somewhat different than, say, a voting system, which has very limited points of access. Basically, for many voting systems, the point of access is a soldering iron and a screwdriver. So it's a very different mindset about how can I influence that piece of equipment. And that's the conversation that we often find ourselves having with the press and with lawmakers, is that where we need to put our money and effort is into protecting those things which have the greatest points of vulnerability. And so that puts us in the VR system category a lot of the time, and also some other things like election night reporting and some of the other public facing, or at least vastly larger facing kinds of equipment and software that help us to run elections. So that's where we focused a lot of our energies in the last couple of years, at least post 2016.
And Judd, if I could just add.
Absolutely, go right ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think you really touched on something which is important from, frankly, a political standpoint, small p politics,
Right.
which is that very often in the mind's eye of the public, when they think of election security, and I don't blame anyone for thinking this, their first thought is about vote tallies or totals, or hacking, so-called, in the polling place with elections equipment. So when someone asks, will my vote be hacked? What they probably mean in many cases is, will someone change the outcome? Will someone add or subtract a zero, let's say, from someone's vote total, or a digit, or will someone zero out a result somehow? And what I always say is, and obviously our systems are different in Colorado or Minnesota because we have 4,000 polling places across the state and all the rest. Here is, I am less concerned, not unconcerned, less concerned about mischief in the polling place than I am with mischief having to do with the big database. We call it SVRS, Statewide Voter Registration System, but that's where the vulnerability was in 2016, when famously a number of states, including ours, were at least the target of, successful or unsuccessful, some sort of intrusion by a foreign adversary. That, as you say, is where time, attention, and resources need to be devoted. And sometimes explaining that in as helpful a way as possible to the public is good, and also allays a fear, because many people, in my experience, at least here, the first priority, or the thing that they think of first, is that polling place experience, and whether literally someone's going to add a 0 or 2 to someone's vote tally. And we have other many checks in place to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen. Even if someone did attempt that, that's a different story than getting into the databases. That's where the biggest vulnerability is.
Great point. The other great thing that both Minnesota and Colorado have is, because we're same-day registration states, a lot of the voter registration issues that are potential vulnerabilities that we need to do our best to protect can be overcome on election day or during early voting because we can address it. Our law allows us to address it in real time. Obviously, if you had tens of thousands of those, that's very difficult and would really make an election very difficult. But the sort of individual nature of potential vulnerabilities to voter reg filings kind of lets you go in and make those adjustments in a same-day setting. So if you're a state that doesn't have same-day registration, that's really a protection that is available if your state's willing to go that way.
That's right. I'm often asked the question, well, you talk about this cybersecurity threat or election security threat, explain to me, a person might say, what's the worst case scenario? What is it you're trying to protect against? Not just a concept, but what's a real world thing? And I mentioned in Minnesota that fortunately we have same-day voter registration. So if, for example, a voter walked into a polling place and as a result of hacking or intrusion, they were just not on the list, just not there. No record of this person having been registered. Maybe they've been voting for years or decades in the same spot. The answer would be, sure, they would stomp their feet and roll their eyes, as any of us would. And the answer in Minnesota would be, okay, fine, just give me the form, I'll register right here and now. There are other scenarios, though, in addition to the one you outlined, Judd, about just sheer volume. okay, if it happens to one person or 100 people, well, what if it happens to 100,000 people or 200,000 or 500,000 people? That in itself would be a problem. The other one is, you know, I don't want to give a roadmap to the bad guys here, but this is already out there in the popular press and elsewhere, so I'm not revealing some secret vulnerability. Another one would be, maybe a more devious one would be, what if someone walks in and they say, oh no, you're on the list all right, but we have you as having voted absentee already. You can't vote here. You're on the list. You sure are, and I know you've been coming here since 1978. I see that in the record, but you can't. You're not entitled to vote here. You've already been you voted absentee. In Minnesota, we don't have any mechanism really, apart from maybe the courts. But very few voters are going to avail themselves about that and lawyer up immediately and go to a court. That would be a difficult situation. So there are vulnerabilities, and not to mention too, just the idea, whether it's by dint of volume or not, just sowing confusion and chaos. Word would get around, even if it happened to 100 people.
Yep. Social
media is such that word would get around and would introduce doubt about the integrity of the election.
So we just sort of talked about broadly the technology side, but on the policy side, I'll throw out something that Colorado is doing that you might have a relevant comparison for. We passed an administrative rule that requires counties to inform us if they have a cybersecurity incident, so that we can go on the back end and make sure that the cyber protections that we have in place for that county and for the state haven't been affected by a cyber incident that's happened at the local level. Does Minnesota have something like that?
Funny you should ask. We're in the middle of our legislative session right now, and our interpretation is we do not presently have the power to do that by administrative rule. We would have to do that by statute. So we're seeking that authority. And, the way I've pitched it is, look, we have a very good relationship with the counties. It really is very good. But someday it may not be. I'm the 22nd Minnesota Secretary of State. There will be 22 at least after me. And there's no guarantee that one of my successors will have a terrible feud with all the counties. And I know in some states I won't name, I read election line. The counties and the Secretary of State's office have very bad relations and don't want to disclose things to one another. And there are, all sorts of politics involved. And so I can't look out into the future long enough to know if that would ever happen in Minnesota. So we're seeking legislative authority to do that, compel disclosure. I will say, maybe this is getting a little weedy, Judd, but as you know, one thing that has helped us in that, so let's say nothing happened this year in Minnesota on that score. I'm really encouraged by the recent and pretty seismic change in policy from the FBI. I'm not sure if anyone tuned in is aware of this issue, but the FBI for a long time, not just in this area, but in other areas, has had a long-standing policy stretching back to the 1930s, I'm told, of interpreting very narrowly the definition of a victim of a crime, such that it was not clear until a recent policy change that we in the state of Minnesota and other states, Colorado or anyone else, would automatically be notified if there were an incident that the FBI or others detected at the local government level. So unless they told us voluntarily, we wouldn't necessarily be on the hotline or on the short list for the FBI because we're not considered a victim. That policy has changed recently. I'm told in law enforcement circles that was a pretty big deal for the FBI. So now, as a result of that, I'm not saying we don't still need the legislation. We do. We want it. We want belt and suspenders at the very least. But this new FBI policy, if carried out, which I expect it will be, means that we will now, more often than not, be also considered a victim of a crime that happens in a certain county in Minnesota or a particular intrusion that's detected. We would be notified of that as well. We still do want that reporting from the counties, but this has really made our life easier, and we think will in the coming years.
Yeah, and that FBI policy has extended to DHS now. They made an announcement about that last week. So both the big reporting agencies where we're most likely to have that sort of victim orientation they have a set policy that if somebody lower in the chain has one of those incidents, we'll be informed of it so we can go do the back end check to make sure that nothing happened in the statewide system. So that's a fantastic policy change, which we were long encouraging those federal agencies to do, and we're really happy they did it.
Can I say, Joe, Judd, on the subject of compelled disclosure of things, another thing that we are seeking by legislation, because we don't have the capacity or the authority to do it by legislative rule, is disclosure by vendors. And disclosure in particular by vendors of ownership. Now, I want to pause here and say, I don't mean this to cast aspersion on anyone whose ownership comes from a certain part of the world or any other part of the world. But most of the companies that do election equipment or related products are privately held, and there wouldn't necessarily be a way for us to know that a particular person or investor from a particular place was a part owner of this. And that alone is not cause to suspect that there's any wrongdoing or potential wrongdoing or bad plan out there. But we do think it's important for us to know over time, for those who are selling stuff to people who administer elections, who are you? And we'll see how that goes. We've talked with folks in other states about that as well, so we're seeking more information there as well. We just think it's important to know, and it's not easily knowable all the time.
Yeah, and supply chain issues are probably that last piece that's out there that we really haven't made a lot of headway on yet. So we have a couple of questions. Why don't we jump to those? Just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A option, or you can put them into the webinar chat function. The first question we have is from John Bowden, who is basically saying, look, given the conversation about cybersecurity threats and the effect that that's had on the conversation about the remote election options, so UOCAVA ballot delivery, how would we advise John to help him advance some real voting options for people in a UOCAVA status when we really are talking about things like email attachments and other ways in which we could get those ballots back? Do you guys in Minnesota have any thoughts on that?
I do, in the sense that I know where we stand among the states. Last I checked, and it was just about half and half. I think it was 25 states to 25. I think DC was the tiebreaker, who allow, now all states, is my understanding, certainly Minnesota, we allow a ballot to be sent electronically, of course, to a UOCAVA voter, someone overseas. But we are not among the states, and it's about half and half. We are not among the states that allow it to be transmitted electronically, a completed ballot on the way back. I don't know if Colorado is or not. And as you can well imagine, since 2016, any efforts to do so, and there was such a movement in the year 2016, earlier in the year, that has all been pretty much frozen right now. No one is much interested at all in Minnesota about talking about a way to electronically transmit a completed, as opposed to a blank, a completed ballot. That is totally frozen. That has ended for the time being. I'm not saying it will never be revived, but right now that is a dead discussion in Minnesota.
Well, electronic ballot delivery gets you a lot of the way there because it speeds that ballot to your UOCAVA voter. It maybe saves 10 days, 8 days, 12 days on that front end. So just having that as a basic system, allowing your UOCAVA voters to get that ballot delivered to them right away is a huge benefit. We see the electronic return as something that's in our system that we do allow. It's an attachment function, which is what John is alluding to. And we have sort of a special secure system, which we call secure ballot return, that we offer our voters, which the lion's share of people that return their ballot electronically use this secure system. And it's basically an encrypted file transfer. So instead of it going across a normal email delivery system, it's a file exchange where you drop it into a file and then the county can securely enter that file and take that encrypted file and pull it into their part of the file system. So it's not the typical email exchange that some states employ. And for that reason, I think it's got some security protections that traditional email doesn't have and might be attractive for those states that are still in the non-electronic return bucket. And if they're looking for some information on that, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to provide some ways in which you could employ a secure ballot return or something like it at your state or county level. Second question we've got from Scott Haverly. He's asking, at the state level, are you concerned that incidents similar to that's happened in Texas in the last year, where many small counties may have been targeted by a cyber attack 2 or 3 days prior to an election, and that's caused some doubt or disruption to normal elections related activities? Have you seen that in Minnesota, and is that something that you're concerned about?
It is something we're concerned about for sure. Looking at Bill sitting next to me, I know that keeps him up at night. And you know, we've got some small counties in Minnesota, as many folks tuning in have in their states, I bet, as well. You know, we have one county in Minnesota that does not have a stoplight. We have counties that have 2,000 people in them. So I just want to make sure to emphasize what I'm not saying. I'm not saying because a county is small or the population is sparse that they have a diminished concern for election security, but it's a matter of resources and personnel. I think they care as much and are just as good at what they do as anyone else. So I want to make sure I'm getting that out. But it is a question of resources, and sometimes, and Bill can speak to this maybe briefly, you encounter folks sometimes in a smaller jurisdiction who basically think, well, surely the bad guys have bigger fish to fry. I mean, this is just little old us, and why would anyone mess with us, and that sort of thing. And I don't want to stereotype. It happens on occasion, but we got to help us all get past that mindset. We truly are only as strong as our weakest link. Bill, do you want to add just a little bit about that?
I absolutely agree with that. And as I've kind of begun to network with each of the counties of Minnesota, I've certainly found examples of those who are less willing to believe that this is a concern that they need to worry about. But what I also think is relevant is that as we've expanded our outreach between our office and the counties, one of the interesting sort of byproducts of that was the collaboration that that's driving within the county staffs themselves. So certainly IT directors and election directors know each other at every county. But in a lot of cases that I've found already, they haven't spent a lot of time learning each other's business. And so getting those two individuals or their staffs and teams together to talk about what matters, what's the priority, what's the timeline of operations, when do you need this system, when can I take it down to do things? Those discussions traditionally, I think, have been sort of on the punch ticket type of exchange, where the IT guy's got a list of customers at the county level he has to serve. By driving them to understand each other better, we're getting to the point where cyber events at the county level now are looked at through the potential of an election lens. And so certainly not every cyber event at a county government is related to elections. But at least there's a light bulb that clicks with the IT staff that says, that's weird. Next week's the election. I better tell the election director that this happened so that we can make sure there's no impact over there. We're driving internal collaboration at the county level, which is a great thing.
Yeah, and the old version of that was, I need to know if you're doing road construction, is that road construction related to or in proximity to my election? Is it in proximity to my polling place? Those were the conversations that occurred 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And now what we've done is added this new layer of conversation when you're talking to not just your roads and bridges guys, but you're also talking to your cyber folks. If you're seeing a specific incident that worries you and it's in proximity to the election, that's something we need to know about. In the same way, we need to know, don't cut down that tree on election day that closes that road that's in proximity to my polling place. So it's all just an evolution in the conversations that we need to be having. So I'm curious, this has been a phenomenon in Colorado recently, but do you have any particular strategies, or you're working with your Minnesota counties on things like ransomware? And do you have pretty good membership in EISAC among your counties?
Well, I know that Bill here, one of his missions is to make sure that we're 100% state. We're on our way in terms of all the counties. We got a large percentage, and I'll let him just say a word about that. But yeah, I mean, I think ransomware is a big issue. Talk about keeping people up at night, because it's real. And not only is it real, but it's been traced in this country, although not yet in the election context, really. It's got the fingerprints of some foreign adversaries. So, for example, and this has been reported publicly, so I'm not disclosing anything I shouldn't, when the U.S. took out General Soleimani, one of the reasons that there was such a quick and speedy and admirable response by Homeland Security in getting together a group of elections administrators immediately within 24, 36 hours on the phone was because apparently there are Iranian fingerprints, so to speak, on some ransomware attacks throughout this country. So yes, we're concerned about it. That's one particular species of concern. I don't know, Bill, you want to talk about that in particular?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the ransomware thing has been a significant evolution of cyber threat, especially to county and local governments. They seem to have taken the brunt, school districts also in the last year or so, for a lot of reasons related to their traditional posture and the significance they place on security. So in some sense, it's eye-opening for them, and a great deal of effort is being shifted to accommodate that threat. With regards to EISAC, I think, I can't say enough, and I'm sure our county's already tired of hearing me say this. There's no good reason not to take advantage of the services and the resources that are available through that organization. Chief among them, the types of expertise that the counties can access to deal with exactly those types of threats. If you can, we've heard Director Krebs from CISA say, if you can defend yourself against ransomware, you are probably knocking off upwards of 90% of the threat risk to your election architecture. The TTPs and the impacts tend to be the same. And so if a county IT department is serious about countering ransomware and doing all they can to remain current and to do the user training and to take all the prudent steps that EISAC advocates, they're de facto shoring up their election architecture.
And a lot of that is about having the right conversations with the right people, involving the right team to make sure that you're employing the strategies that are most effective for the kind of system that you're running, which sort of dovetails into a next area that I wanted to cover, which is how close a relationship have you had with Department of Homeland Security? Are you employing some of their major offerings? Are you walking through the sort of RVAs and hunts? And are you doing penetration testing, remote penetration testing? Are those the kinds of security offerings that you're getting from the federal government?
Yeah, short answer is yes. And I just want to give credit where it's due. So in early 2017, of course, Department of Homeland Security declared our election systems in this country to be critical infrastructure, so-called, with real meaning under operational meaning in the federal government. And it was a rocky rollout. I think it's safe to say. I'll at least speak for myself. I think many secretaries at the time felt that way. But after a rocky rollout, I think the department has really come a long, long way. And I think the relationship with secretaries and other election administrators is a very good one and getting better all the time, in part through some of the offerings that you just listed. And yes, we're taking advantage of as many of them as we can, particularly the penetration testing, both remotely and then when they'll send teams of people to our office for an entire work week to poke and prod and find the soft spots and issue reports. That is great peace of mind to us, coupled with the federal money. So they're not just swooping in here, giving us a bunch of costly recommendations and leaving. There's money attached. And I think that's been a really good thing. We've been very pleased with our relationship with them and with the offerings. And we hope they continue. I think they will.
Yeah, and some low-hanging fruit there. So if you're a local elections administrator and you're looking for something, what can I do? Sign up for the EISAC, so EISAC. Just look it up on the internet. They have a sign-up sheet right on the front page. Sign up for it. You'll start to get daily and weekly alerts about sort of basic things that you can do to improve your cyber hygiene. Another thing to do is sign up for your cyber hygiene evaluation that DHS can do on a daily basis. They can send you updates about vulnerabilities that they're spotting remotely. And those are the same sort of remote vulnerabilities that somebody in Russia, somebody in China, somewhere around the world might be testing on a daily basis as well. So an easy way for you to sort of tap down that 95%. So find the 95% of your vulnerabilities and take them out just by doing a couple of really simple things. Another thing that we did in Colorado last year and a half ago now, was we asked a number of our counties to participate in a phishing exercise. And the Department of Homeland Security developed a number of phishing emails that had a real good look to them. They were sort of a gradient of obvious phishing email to really difficult to spot phishing email. And we sent them to a number of our counties and then kept track of the likelihood for clicking on the various links or the attachments. And we're able to package that up in a training and then go back to the counties and say, these are the areas in which we're seeing the most vulnerability on these phishing emails. Those are the kinds of things that you need to protect yourself against. So those are a couple of really easy kinds of things that you can do, the federal government offers, and you can partner with them to improve your overall security. So let's jump to you mentioned the 2018 money and some ideas you are planning for that. I'm curious, do you have any plans for the 2019 money, which was a larger sum of money? And of course, I don't want to create any friction with you and your counties, but are there any ideas for helping your counties there as well?
No, exactly, and right, no, that segue doesn't bother me because that's really exactly what we're emphasizing. You know, in the first round, I can give you the numbers. In the first round, we got 6.6 million. That's exclusive of the state match of 5% at that point. So it's really edging up towards 7 million. And we specifically earmarked at least 1 million for local sub-grants to local governments. This time, we're not prepared to give an exact amount yet, but we want a lot more than that. We want a much larger portion to be earmarked for the local governments. And that's because we know how it is ourselves to have another unit of government come in, issue a report full of costly recommendations. And we wouldn't want, much as we appreciate the money that comes with those recommendations, we want to do the same. So whether it's Bill or Bill helping others facilitate solutions that have price tags, often hefty price tags, we want there to be some money that flows at least to offset. You know, we can't promise that it will, you know, purchase all of everything, but at least offset, hopefully significantly offset some of the costs. So last time we got 6.6 million, this time it's 7.4 million. There's a bigger match this time. They're expecting the states to kick in 20%, not 5%. And so the overall amount's going to be a good bit bigger, and we hope to invest some large portion of that in our partners at the local government level.
So we're slightly smaller than you in population. So our money from 2018 was 6.3 million as opposed to 6.6. Actually, with the match, we were at 6.6. And this time we're looking at 8.5. That includes the match. We haven't, as you suggest, we haven't nailed down exactly what we want to do with that money. But our current plans probably are, let's go and invest in a brand new voter reg system. Let's just start over. Let's bolt this down with the best security we can come up with and get a system which we think is probably a little friendlier for our counties and thereby better for our voters. So that's certainly one of the ideas that we focused on, and that would be a quite expensive purchase that might very well soak up a lot of that $8.5 million. So let me just say that we're here for another 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes. Feel free to pose any additional questions if you have them at this point. I happen to have a couple of more questions, so if I don't hear any more, I'll throw them out. Actually, my first question, and I sort of mean this straight, it's going to come out as humor. I don't mean it that way, but how can I get me a Bill Eklund? Where did you find Bill, and what would you advise other states or counties if they were out there trying to find one themselves?
Yeah, well, it was a long process, made longer by the fact that we didn't get the money to hire Bill for quite some time. But we did an exhaustive process. There was a lot of interest in it. So Bill's selection was the product of a really rigorous process with high volume. And in the end, we were really blessed and pleased to find Bill. Bill, we can speak for himself, but he is from Minnesota. This is kind of a homecoming for him, and spent a career in the United States Navy working on these issues, including stints in the intelligence community. And now he's back here in Minnesota, sort of a full circle. Bill, you want to say anything else about your travels and travails?
Mr. Secretary, I would say that's a great segue, and I would say there are other people with similar backgrounds to mine who are interested in a line of work that continues that sense of service and this definitely scratches that itch. So when you have the chance to talk to veterans, clearly the DoD does a lot with network security. There are a lot of people out there, and frankly, there's a lot of us that would like to find a way to come home, continue a sense of service, and perform a function that makes us feel good, that isn't just about corporate bottom line. So I would encourage those interested in establishing this type of position to stroke that chord a little bit, and to look for people with the background knowledge like mine.
And let me just say, Judd, that we want to, as I think I mentioned, we want to get him some company. We have Bill, and we're thrilled to have him, but it's one person for 87 counties. Like Colorado, there's a lot of pretty large physically, this state, and you even got mountains, so that makes it even tougher to get out and about. And so so we'd like to get him some company. Illinois, for example, hired 8 cyber navigators. We're not as big as Illinois, but even on a pro rata basis, surely 2, 3, maybe even 4 would be good. And the need really truly is out there. And so it's been a great experiment. As I say, other states recommended this approach highly.
Yeah, we have a current posting for what we call an election security manager, which sounds a lot like Bill Eklund. Bill, feel free to go ahead and apply if you'd like. And then we're going to build out that team, probably add 2 more folks. And then we also have some positions in our existing election staff, which have sort of morphed into security related functions. And as we have a county support team, and as we build out that team and add new members, you have attrition and you replace. We're going to replace those members with some folks that have some security wherewithal, so that we can always be improving on that area. So, well, we've almost hit the magic mark of 1 p.m. or at least 1 p.m. my time, 2 p.m. your time. Let me do one more thing. I know that we want to advise people of some upcoming courses that are available. So, Lee, I think you were going to put up some information on upcoming CEA courses. So you can see there on the screen that my election security course on how to protect America's elections is scheduled to start here in 12 days, I guess, 12 days. I better get on that. And we'll go through May 4th. We also have another course on voter participation. Those are 2 courses that you can still sign up for. There's no deadline between now and March 17th. So feel free to sign up for those. And they are remote courses. So if you live somewhere outside of the Minneapolis-St. Paul region, you can still participate in that and sign up and be a full-fledged member of that course. I'm teaching it from Denver, Colorado. So there you go. It kind of illustrates the way we roll. And that's part of a larger program of courses for elections administration. And then we have an upcoming webinar from Amy Wilson. Amy Wilson is the trainer for our office and is a fantastic elections administrator. She used to be the elections director in Utah, and we stole them away from Utah. So like I say, Steve, you should be, or Secretary Simon, you should be worried that I'm out for Bill Eklund there. So
I don't ski, Judd. I'm sorry. I'm flat ladder.
Too bad. Well, if you're a fly fisherman, we've also got that, but we'll work on it. So she has a webinar coming up on April 8th. That's at noon Central Time, and that's talking about improved training for your poll workers. So this is, again, pulling in a lot of those security elements, because even when you're doing basic training on how to employ an election, how to issue ballots, how to receive ballots, you're also employing a lot of those election security functions as well. So I know that Amy's going to do a fantastic job in that webinar, and it's on April 8th. Just a heads up a little bit about my course. We're going to be talking about what happened in 2016 and sort of what that meant for the country. And then we'll do a deep dive into some of those DHS offerings and EISAC functions. We're also going to talk about creating a tabletop exercise. So we've done tabletop exercises here in Colorado, and they're scenario driven. So we'll talk about scenarios. In fact, you as a student could even get to write a scenario and tell us about the effect that that scenario would have and the instruction element of that scenario. And then we'll spend a week on misinformation and disinformation, so public confidence in elections. So all of that's in the course. I encourage you to sign up if you're interested. You can see there the link to learn more. And then if you have any questions or comments about this webinar and the class, you can reach out to Lee. And then that's my email as well if you want to know more. Secretary Simon, any closing thoughts?
My only closing thought is that this issue is not going away. I don't think this is a fad or some sort of fleeting concern. I think election security is with us to stay for the foreseeable future. So this is, fortunately or unfortunately, a growth industry, so to speak. And so I applaud everyone for being tuning in here today because these are really, really important concerns that will be with us for a long, long time.
I think those are wise words. I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll thank everybody for joining us. We really do appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.